In this podcast episode, journalist and author Katie Herzog discusses her complex relationship with alcohol, the cultural environment that shaped her drinking habits, and an unconventional but evidence-backed treatment for alcohol dependence known as the Sinclair Method. Herzog's relationship with alcohol began early, in middle school, where she was immersed in a drinking culture that normalized teenage alcohol use. Drinking was not merely a social activity, but the fabric of daily life throughout her teenage years and into adulthood. She recounts how, during her 20s and 30s, her drinking escalated from social and party-driven to solitary and secretive, marked by several perilous and embarrassing episodes. Herzog candidly shares a striking misadventure involving a fire caused by a cigarette, exemplifying the dangerous consequences she faced. Despite these troubles, her drinking was a normative pattern within her peer group and the nightlife scene she inhabited as a club promoter, where alcohol was deeply intertwined with identity and community. The cultural context Herzog describes is significant in understanding how alcohol functions beyond its biochemical effects. It acts as a social glue, a ritual, and a shared language that can simultaneously enable connection and mask addiction. She highlights how difficult it was to disentangle drinking from social life, particularly given the reinforcement from friends who viewed drunken escapades as rites of passage rather than warning signs. From an early age, Herzog recognized that her drinking was problematic. Unlike many of her peers who aged out of heavy drinking through natural recovery, where real-life responsibilities converged to reduce alcohol consumption, she remained trapped in a cycle of dependency well beyond that phase. This led to numerous attempts to moderate or quit, including trying Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, therapy, and behavioral strategies such as moderation management and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. However, these efforts never sustained long-term sobriety, often collapsing after no more than 30 sober days. She elucidates the internal conflict faced by many with alcohol use disorder, a paradoxical love and hate relationship with alcohol. Herzog loved the intoxicating effects, but suffered from the uncontrollable cravings and the hijacked nature of her decision-making processes. Importantly, she rejects the simplistic notion that alcoholism is merely about loving alcohol more than family or life. Rather, she emphasizes that addiction renders rational choice nearly impossible, an experience echoed in the well-known AA adage, "You are powerless over alcohol." The conversation turns to the neuroscience behind alcohol addiction, where Herzog explains that alcohol's effects vary widely among individuals. She conceptualizes two broad types of drinkers: reward drinkers, who experience energized euphoria from drinking, and relief drinkers, who consume alcohol primarily for its sedative and anxiety-dampening effects. Herzog identified strongly as a reward drinker in her younger years, seeking the euphoric buzz that provided energy and sociability. However, as addiction progresses, even reward drinkers often transition toward drinking to relieve withdrawal and negative feelings. Her insight into genetic and environmental risk factors, such as early age of first drink, family history, and repeated exposure, offers a nuanced view that alcohol use disorder is a complex interplay of biology and circumstance, rather than a mere moral failing or poor choice. She stresses how habitual coping via alcohol from a young age impairs the development of healthier strategies, making recovery later in life even more challenging. A significant portion of the discussion examines the history and philosophy of addiction treatment, particularly contrasting traditional approaches like AA with emerging medical models. Herzog outlines AA's origins during the 1930s, emphasizing its success in creating a supportive community and reducing stigma through the disease model of addiction, largely popularized by early advocates like Marty Mann. However, Herzog critically notes that AA is not effective for everyone, including herself, especially because AA does not address the biological cravings that can drive relapse. She describes her personal disconnect with AA's spiritual elements, communal requirements, and introspective demands, which did not align with her skeptical and nonconformist personality. Although AA and similar 12-step programs provide essential support for many, Herzog calls attention to the over-moralization and under-medicalization of alcohol use disorder that has prevailed historically, hindering acceptance of alternative treatments. At the heart of the podcast is Herzog's account of discovering and successfully employing the Sinclair Method, a pharmacological approach to reducing and eventually extinguishing alcohol dependency. The method involves taking naltrexone, an opioid receptor antagonist originally synthesized in the 1960s and FDA approved since 1994 for alcohol use disorder, shortly before drinking. Unlike the traditional use of naltrexone as a daily medication regardless of drinking, the Sinclair method requires ingestion only an hour before consuming alcohol. This timing ensures that the drug blocks the endorphin-driven euphoria from alcohol consumption, effectively decoupling drinking from its rewarding effects. Herzog vividly explains how this pharmacological extinction retrains the brain over months, reducing cravings and making abstinence easier. This regimen allowed her to transition from relentless obsession with alcohol to complete sobriety after roughly 7 months. Herzog emphasizes the disciplined commitment needed, noting this approach requires consistency and is not a quick fix, but its effectiveness for many reward drinkers is well supported by clinical research. She further discusses why the Sinclair method remains underutilized despite its strong evidence base. Barriers include lack of medical education about addiction treatments, physicians' hesitation to endorse a method that permits drinking during recovery, legal liability concerns, and poor pharmaceutical marketing due to generic drug pricing. Additionally, the stigma attached to addiction treatment and misconceptions about opioid-related drugs complicate adoption. The podcast also explores societal shifts in drinking patterns, particularly among younger generations, and the increasingly popular sober curious movement that challenges traditional cultural norms related to alcohol. Herzog reflects on how the decline of smoking and changes in social technology have altered bonding rituals, replacing spontaneous conversations with isolated screen time. Herzog and the host discuss the paradoxical pressures that come with sobriety, including social exclusion and triggering of friends' insecurities, underscoring the importance of support networks and cultural change in facilitating recovery. They lament the loss of unstructured social experiences and rites of passage that, despite their risks, provided valuable interpersonal learning. Finally, Herzog frames her book and advocacy as part of a mission to broaden the conversation around alcohol use disorder, promoting alternatives to the abstinence-only narrative and empowering individuals with more knowledge and options to reclaim their lives.